he might be swept off. Those words of counsel are given by Bilbo Baggins to his nephew Frodo in J.R.R. Tolkien's classic novel, The Lord of the Rings. Bilbo Baggins is the central character in the prequel to The Lord of the Rings called The Hobbit. Bilbo Baggins is a hobbit. As a hobbit, he's a little person. Sometimes they call him halfling. It's barely visible to the big people in the fictional land of Middle-earth that Tolkien writes to us about. He lives a secluded life with fellow hobbits in a little village called the Shire. Hobbits are fond of good food, good drink, good company, but they are not fond of adventure. They don't like to take risks. That all changed one day when Bilbo Baggins was visited by a cohort of 12 dwarves and the great wizard Gandalf. They came to offer Bilbo an opportunity to join them on a quest to travel across Middle-earth to take control over the home and the treasure of the dwarves that had been taken over by a dragon decades before. Now, Bilbo Baggins, who was not a risk-taker, was not interested in taking this journey. He looked at himself as a little person living a quiet life and said, I don't have anything I can give these dwarves. Why would they even be asking me to take this journey? So Bilbo Baggins turned them down, and the dwarves left on their quest, leaving Bilbo behind. But that night, Bilbo had second thoughts, and woke up the next morning and decided that he was going to take the journey, to take the risk, and to see what the future had in store for him, what he might be able to do to help the dwarves. And he joined them and changed Middle-earth forever. The parable today comes in a section of Matthew where we see Jesus kind of building a crescendo from his entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, through the turning over of the tables in the temple, and a series of teachings and parables that kind of point out to the religious leaders at the time that they weren't being faithful to the call that God had given them. At the end of this crescendo, Jesus would be put on trial, he would be tortured, and he would be put to death on the cross, executed as a criminal. In the parable, Jesus introduces us to a master and 3 entrusted servants. Now, I believe these servants were trusted very much because the master entrusted them with his precious things. The word that I used in the gospel to talk about cherished things is often just translated as property. But when I looked at the Greek text, the word that's used in Greek to describe property comes from the verb parko, which means to insist. So the master was leaving with them things that were very, very important and precious to him, probably inherited from his family and his land and his house. In addition, he gave each of the servants some money to manage. A talent was a unit of weight, which was used to calibrate money, currency, in Palestine at the time. And it can be lost to us because he only uses the denominations of 5 talents, 2 talents, and 1 talent, how much money that really was. Most scholars say that a talent was worth maybe 15 to 20 times a worker's wage. Projecting that into modern times, even if we just use the federal poverty level, that meant that 1 talent was worth $300,000. 5 talents would have been worth $1.5 million. So this was no small sum that he was giving his servants to take care of the land. Now, before I go further, I want to explain to you what I think the parable is not about. The stewardship committee is going to get mad at me for this, but the parable is not about money. It uses money, but it's not about money. And it's also not about a prosperity gospel that promises great riches if you do great things. That's not what this is about either. What it is about, though, is a call for us to live out our lives of faithfulness. The lives of faithfulness that are gifts from God. Let's take take a look at the two servants, the first two servants. Both of them went out and put their money to work. We're not told what they did. That's not important in the story. What's important is that they took risks, that they stepped out in faith, knowing that what they were doing was going to come back to them based on the joy of their master. When they returned to the master, or when the master returns to them and asks them to account for what they did with the money, both of them come back and bring double what they had been given. The master's response is joyful. He says to them, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master." The reward for living a life of faithfulness is more participation in the joy of living in God's kingdom. But then there's the third servant. And every Bible study that I've ever led that talked about this parable, the third servant is the one that gets the most discussion. Why was the third servant treated so harshly? Really, what did he do? He just acted conservatively, right? He took what he had. He didn't lose it. He didn't squander it on prodigal living. He merely kept it protected and safe. So when the master returned, the master would have what was his. But the point of the story is not that he was protecting it, but the point was why. See, this servant acted out of fear. He did not act out of faith. He was afraid. He was afraid of what the master would do when the master came back. Now, the first two servants didn't seem to have that fear, but the third servant was fearful of what the master would do. And as a result of that fear, he just buried the money and didn't do anything with it. Martin Luther called this type of selfishness, this turning in on oneself, as really the root of all sin. So what he called Curvatus say when we curve in on ourselves. The contrast between the third servant and the first two is that the first two servants were curved out to do something with what they had been given. They took what the master gave and turned it into something even more beautiful and more bountiful than what they started out. Now I know that when we think of this parable, we probably look at the first two servants and the third servant, and we see a little bit of ourselves in each one, right? Sometimes we feel good, we're acting very faithful with what God has given us, and sometimes we're a little protective, a little shy, maybe a little afraid to do with our lives what God has called us to do. Does that mean that the punishment that was pronounced on the third servant is also something that we have to worry about? Well, St. Paul has something to say about that, doesn't he? In Thessalonians, he writes that we are not in darkness. We don't have to worry about the outer darkness because of the gift that we have received. We wear the breastplate of faith and love. We've already been spared the punishment because God has given us a wonderful gift, and that is our life that we lived out in faithfulness. It's a gift that is affirmed to us on our baptism, sealed with the water of baptism, that God has promised that we have this gift and that we will not be thrown into the darkness. It's a promise that we renew each week when we gather at the table for Eucharist, and after which we get sent out in the love of Christ to live our faithful lives in the world. A few weeks ago, many of you know that I lost my grandmother at the age of 99. She was a wonderful, wonderful person. I remember my sister and I lived with her for 9 years when we were children, so she helped raise us. In her later years, Nana wasn't, she didn't go out much. She was kind of frail. But she always showed her faithfulness, no matter when you saw her, when you talked to her. I remember over the summer when Aunt Marie had her melanoma removed and she was recuperating, Nana called her up and offered to come and help her, do whatever she could. Now Nana was shut in. 3 years she hadn't left her house. We knew that she couldn't physically do that, but just the offer, just the words of encouragement, just the words of hope made all the difference to my wife Aunt Marie. Even to the end, Nana lived out her life of faithfulness. It's a dangerous thing going out your front door Bilbo said to Frodo. When Bilbo left the Shire to go along with the dwarves on their quest, he didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't know if he would return. He didn't even know if he would live. But if he had stayed home, the Ring of Power would not have been discovered. Probably would have fallen into the hands of the evil forces in control of Middle-earth, and Middle-earth would have been destroyed as we know it. But Bilbo decided to step out, to take a risk, to live a life of faithfulness, and as a result, Middle-earth was saved from the evil forces in play. So we've been given this gift of faithfulness, this gift of a life, by our loving and true Master. Why don't we go out and change the world too?